Hello. It's so good to see you all. Welcome to the John Carter Brown Library. I'm Karen Wolf, and I'm the director and librarian here at the JCB, and it is my absolute pleasure to have you with us on this very beautiful May day in Providence. So this evening is part of our partnership series with the Providence Athenaeum on the expansive histories of the early Americas. We started this series 2 years ago, and we've hosted an incredible group of folks: Nicole Eustace, Loren Spears, Rachel Swarns, David Gran, and now Rebecca Romney. And it is the first time that we've held the event here in the library, so that feels special. I want to thank Matt Barisi in particular and all the folks at the Athenaeum for this really wonderful and meaningful partnership. It's been really special for us, and we are really super grateful to you. And I hope all of you will come back, not just to our partner events with the Athenaeum next year, but also to the events that we host regularly here at the JCB too. So in a minute, I'm going to tell you a little bit about tonight's run of show. But first, I want to set the scene for a minute. For our having Rebecca Romney here at the JCB, we are a rare books library focused on the early Americas, North and South America, from the 15th century through the early 19th century. And how does Jane Austen and her bookshelf fit the bill for the expansive histories of the early Americas? Well, in part, that's thanks to Rebecca herself. Little bit of an anecdote here. I was already a fan of Rebecca's when I overheard her in my first time at the New York Book Fair instructing a very wrongly skeptical browser about the value of the singer Amy Winehouse's collection of marginalized romance paperbacks. It was an incredible thing to witness, I just have to say. But 2 years ago, the JCB acquired an important manuscript map of a Jamaica plantation, Belvedere, that was owned by one of Jane Austen's uncles. There is a lot of Jane Austen scholarship now about the connections, always implicit in her work and explicit in Mansfield Park, of Austen's novels to the British Empire and to slavery in particular. But this map is remarkable for one reason, and it has nothing to do with Jane Austen. Rather, this map lists particular enslaved people by name according to the provision grounds where they were allotted to grow their own food and other goods for sustenance or for market. And this is exceptionally rare information to appear on maps of this period. Needless to say, given our collections, we were really excited to bring this into the research community, and it's already inspired quite a lot of work and reflection. So we acquired this map, and this was right after I had had another conversation with Rebecca about the JCB, where I said something really confident about how the JCB does not go out and acquire like trophy things. We don't acquire like Shakespeare or Jane Austen or something like that just to have them. Rather, we acquire carefully, item by item, to enhance the research value of the whole collection. And I found myself turning around after we acquired this map, which, by the way, is in an exhibit case right at the back for you to see, and saying to Rebecca, "Do you have a first American edition of Mansfield Park?" And it was amazing because she did. It was like the very week, in fact, and I had missed it. I'm a devotee of Rebecca's Instagram account. Many of you may follow her on social media. But she had just, in fact, been showing this, and I don't know, it was like in the air. I hadn't seen that. But anyway, so we now have that copy of Mansfield Park here. And in fact, we've done quite a bit of programming between the map and that copy. So believe me, I could go on about this connection. But part of the partnership with Providence Athenaeum is that Matt and I take turns in introducing our speakers and in conversation with them. So Matt is about to do a proper introduction for Rebecca. And then Rebecca will talk to all of us. Then Matt is going to join Rebecca on stage for a conversation. All of this will be on our live stream. Then we're going to say goodbye to our friends online and have some time just for some audience Q&A here in the library, then a reception, and Rebecca will sign some books. So without further ado, my friend Matt, the executive director of the Providence Athenaeum.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming, and I'm so pleased to be here tonight and to be in partnership with the John Carter Brown Library, which is a magnificent institution, and Karen and all her team, who are just fantastic. So thanks to them for all their hard work in making this happen. It's my privilege tonight to introduce tonight's speaker, Rebecca Romney. She's a rare book dealer and the co-founder of Type Punch Matrix, a rare book company based in Washington, D.C. She is the rare book specialist on the History Channel's show Pawn Stars and a co-founder of the Honey and Wax Book Collecting Prize. In 2019, she was featured in the documentary on the rare book trade, The Booksellers. Romney is the author with JP Romney of Printer's Error, Irreverent Stories from Book History, and the romance novel in English, A Survey in Rare Books, 1769 to 1999. Her work as a bookseller and as a writer has been featured in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Forbes, Variety, the Paris Review, and many other outlets. She's here tonight to discuss her new book, Jane Austen's Bookshelf, a wonderfully accessible journey to reclaim the legacy of 8 women writers who inspired Jane Austen. These figures, many of whom were quite prominent and successful in their own time, have largely been forgotten or neglected by canonical prejudice, and in her book, Romney gives them back to us. It's an important work of historical reconstruction, and it gives us a much fuller picture of the development of the novel as an art form and of the progression of Jane Austen as an artist. Ladies and gentlemen, Rebecca Romney.
Hello, thank you so much for that warm welcome. It was a delight to get this invitation to come here because you've already heard the story of Mansfield Park. It felt a little meant to be. Sometimes book collecting works that way. There's a little bit of serendipity involved. And certainly there is the case for my own book. So I do want to, for those of you who are unfamiliar, I'm going to, right from the beginning, give you a sense of my book, what it's about, and I want to take you on a miniature tour relating to some of the women who are in my book with a lot of pretty pictures, I hope, of the books that I collected while I worked on this. But first, this is the book that started it all. The seed for my book, Jane Austen's Bookshelf, which was my exploration of the women writers who inspired Jane Austen, began with my work as a rare book dealer because I was doing what I do in my everyday job as I was looking for rare books. I cannot manufacture my product. I have to find my product. And so I spend a huge amount of my time just looking for these definitionally rare books. And so I was on what's called house call. I mean, not like a doctor, but in our own rare book way. I was on a house call, so I was at a private collector's home, and I was looking at her library, and I was looking at volumes with the idea of ones that I would acquire and buy for my shop, and then catalog and sell them. And this was one of the books that was on the shelf. It was on this shelf, in fact, where there were a bunch of books that looked pretty much just like this. They had that dark emerald green background and these elaborate gilt stamp designs on them. I didn't even need to see the titles. I wasn't looking at the titles. I bought those books for their covers. I just said, that whole shelf, we'll take that whole shelf. Very practical rare book dealer. I didn't know about the text, really. I had no particular interest in the text. I was buying it because of the cover. I was going to sell it because of the cover. It was part of a very famous turn-of-the-century series published by Macmillan that was nicknamed the Cranford series after Elizabeth Gaskell's novel Cranford. And they were incredibly popular reprint series in these type of arts and crafts or Art Nouveau-inspired designs. But I do have professional pride. So when I was working on cataloging this book, I decided I need to spend a little bit more time with Frances Burney. And when I describe cataloging as a rare book dealer, I want to be clear about what I mean by that. So we have our buying side. I've already described we have to find the material. I don't get to manufacture it. You understand the selling side. I put a price on it. I sell it to either collectors or institutions. But in between that, I catalog it, which means I'm producing a unique record for that particular book. And by that particular book, I mean that book as an object. So I'm not only declaring which edition it is, this is from the Cranford series, but I'm also looking at its condition. I'm looking to see if it's complete. I'm looking to see if it has any ownership inscriptions, so its provenance, its history of ownership, right? So I'm treating the book as a historical artifact, and my cataloging is creating that record of that particular book. So while I was doing that, I had this moment where I said, I remember reading about this book in a book collecting book. Edward Newton, it's his Amenities of Book Collecting, if you like book collecting books at all. It's a very famous book from the early 20th century. He talks about the beginnings with this book, how it was published anonymously, etc. And so I was aware of it, but it never crossed my mind at all that I might want to read it, at all. And so in this case, I also did not initially have that thought. But I thought I should just review my Frances Burney. And when I just did a little bit of internet searching, I quickly learned something that I had not learned from Edward Newton, which was that Frances Burney was one of Jane Austen's favorite writers. And that, in fact, the phrase Pride and Prejudice likely came from Frances Burney's second novel, Cecilia. And I had this moment where I went, what? I was, frankly, professionally embarrassed because this is what I do. I handle first editions across this development of the novel in English as my job. And I've sold a number of Jane Austen first editions. I've sold Samuel Richardson. I've sold Henry Fielding. And this particular author I thought wasn't worth my time, apparently. And I had no idea the influence that she had had on Austen. I knew about Samuel Richardson, for example. And that was something that gave me a real pause because I went, okay, I love Jane Austen, so why don't I make this little project? I will investigate her reading and see who influenced her. This was an unexpected influence. And then as I'm going through all of her favorite authors, Samuel Richardson and Shakespeare and Milton, she likes Cooper and poetry, right? She likes Samuel Johnson. I had read all of them. Frances Burney, Maria Edgeworth, Charlotte Lennox, Charlotte Smith, Elizabeth Inchbald. I had read none of them. I had read all of the men and none of the women, not one of them. It was so stark. I thought, wow, I have just been being sexist this whole time, it turns out. Completely accidentally. It was just how my reading had worked. And so a lot of my journey here was saying, why had I done this? Why had I so systematically only read the men? And I had this moment where I thought, okay, I am turning this into my own recorrection. I am going to course correct and spend maybe a year reading all of these women novelists, the women authors that I had missed. And initially, I thought it was kind of like good medicine, right? I am reading these books and I am going to see, okay, so now I know that just like Richardson or Johnson, I also now know Frances Burney or Ed Radcliffe. But then I read Evelina to start, and it was so good. It was so good. And I had this moment where I realized I am not just going to be reading a bunch of novels that were rightfully forgotten. I'm probably, if Austen loved these books, a lot of them are probably very good, like Evelina was good. And the question then becomes, if they are so good, then why don't we read them anymore? And that's when the project morphed a bit and became much more about what I do professionally, which is the rare book side, the book collecting side. And for me, I wanted to trace the rise and fall of these authors' reputations over time. And one of the best ways to do that is by imprints. Frances Burney is a great example. This book here, this was part of a canonical reprint series. The Cranford series was publishing popular established novels, the way that you see Jane Austen gets a new clothing, every generation, even more than every few years, Penguin's coming out with a newly dressed up, new cover designs for Austen. That's what's happening here with Evelina. So in the 1890s and the early 1900s, that's how Evelina was viewed, but not anymore. So you can literally trace it through the books on these shelves. That was the beginning of my rabbit hole. And because I am a rare book dealer and I've given a lot of thought to how book collecting plays out, I make my living from understanding the psychology of book collectors. Of myself, I am, of course, a collector. I had this moment where I decided I am going to officially turn this into a book collection. And first, I have to come up with my scope and my parameters. So my topic, Jane Austen's bookshelf. But what exactly is covered in that? Is it going to be things that are literally only on her bookshelf? Or should I expand that more? And I felt immediately I needed to expand it more because if I wanted to look at their reputations over time, that would go far beyond Austen's lifetime. because Austen died incredibly young. She died at the age of 41, right? And in fact, Frances Burney, who we just saw, lived longer than Austen, was older than her, and lived longer than her. And what I did is I used Austen herself as my guide for this in terms of my practical parameters for authors. And it's actually this great passage here in Northanger Abbey gives you a sense. My parameter for Austen was, does she mention this book approvingly, in most cases positively, either in her letters or in her novels? So here, this is actually about a 1920s edition of Northanger Abbey. You probably can't read the text, but I will tell you, if you haven't read Northanger Abbey, it is often quickly described as a satire of the Gothic novels that were popular in Austen's day. But Austen is a very complex writer. There's always layers to what she produces. And as much as it has elements of satire, it also has elements of joy and homage, specifically about the joys of reading. Catherine Morland, the heroine, is a huge reader, and so is the hero, Henry Tilney. And that's one of the early things they bond about, is talking about the books that they love. But Northanger Abbey also has this really interesting passage. You can see this is page 22 of this 1920s edition, where Austen, out of nowhere, breaks form. You have Catherine Morland, the heroine, going along, living her life, coming out, meeting society in Bath and all of that. And then Austen gets on kind of a soapbox and says, I don't know why we denigrate novel reading. There's nothing wrong with novel reading. If a woman is sitting there reading a book and it ends up being something, like Milton or The Spectator or something that she's proud of, she's happy to say, oh yes, I'm reading that. But if she pulls out a book and it turns out it's a novel, then she'll say, oh, it's only a novel. And Austen says, why do we do that? She says here, in short, these are only some of the works in which the greatest powers of the mind are displayed, in which the most thorough knowledge of human nature, the happiest delineation of its varieties, the liveliest effusions of wit and humor are conveyed to the world in the best chosen language. That's Austen talking about what novels can do. And then as proof, she names 3 novels. She names 2 by Frances Burney. She names Cecilia and Camilla. I mentioned Cecilia's The Pride and Prejudice, and Camilla, which I'll get to in a moment. And then she also names a novel called Belinda by a woman named Maria Edgeworth, who I'm going to end with. Those were my bookends for this collection. So what I want to do is I just want to give you a quick overview of some of the women that I am talking about here. And I don't expect you to remember the particular titles or much about these individual women. You can dive much more into that in the book if you're interested. If there's only one thing that you take away from today, I want it to be this. Perhaps like me, you assumed that these writers were forgotten because they just weren't any good. And you're about to see how wrong that is. So getting back to Frances Burney, who was one of Austen's favorite writers, she specifically names 2 of the 3 that she names in Northanger Abbey are Frances Burney works. This is one of the ones that she names, a book called Camilla, published in 1796. It was published what we call by subscription. And in the case of subscription edition in this environment in London, what that meant was that the author would get their readers, their subscribers, to pay for it upfront, like a modern crowdsourced project. And then if they got enough funding, the project would come into being, and then the author would get more money from it. Because normally, booksellers and printers, they would essentially say, well, I'm the one taking on all the risk, so I obviously get more of the rewards. And in this case, just like you think of your Kickstarters, for example, they're saying, no, the author is taking on the risk normally that the publisher has, and so then they get more monetary benefits. That was particularly important for Burney because at this time she had just married a titled officer refugee from the French Revolution, and they had no money at all. They used the proceeds of Camilla to build their house, in fact, which they named Camilla Cottage. But if you supported a book by subscription, often the convention was that you would have your name printed in the subscribers list at the beginning of the book. And that's how we have Jane Austen's first appearance in print. Miss J. Austen Steventon at the bottom there. So just a little bit of context. Austen's first book doesn't get published until 1811, Sense and Sensibility. This is 15 years before that. And even then, the novels that are all published during Austen's lifetime don't have her name on them. Sense and Sensibility is published by a lady. Pride and Prejudice is published by the author of Pride and Prejudice, and so on. So you don't actually see her name in any of her books until the posthumously published Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, in which there's a biographical notice by her family in the beginning that names Austen for the first time after her death. So this is it in the book of one of her favorite authors. The other thing is that she took that convention, by the way, from people like Burney. So Burney's first book, Evelina, did not have a name on it. Her next book, Cecilia, was by the author of Evelina. Camilla was by the author of Evelina and Cecilia. So even in the way that you were attributing authorship, Austen was following in established conventions of the time that were done by the authors who were writing books, courtship novels in this case, just like she was. I will also say, since we're at the John Carter Brown, printing novels in the United States, in the sort of very infant United States, there weren't that many that would get printed. But Frances Burney, when her books came out, they ended up having multiple editions in the United States. So starting really in the 1790s, and you see a couple different editions of Evelina and Cecilia, and then Camilla, so this is 1796, has 3 different editions in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, all in 1797. And they are also published by subscription, but by a very different type of subscription in the United States, because Camilla was incredibly long. It was 5 volumes. And so instead, subscribers were essentially paying to fund each of the volumes, and the volumes were coming up over a longer period of time. So it was actually a very different economic model. And these imprints tend to not survive in nearly the same numbers as, say, the UK edition of Camilla, because the paper quality was often much, much lower. And that was for a number of reasons. But one of them, too, was that they also tried to keep the cost much lower. To buy a UK edition, the true first of Camilla, was much more expensive than the editions being put out in New York. In New York, they were trying much more to be like, oh, you can afford this. It's only 4 shillings or 5 shillings or whatever. And so you do see Burney as a great example of, even in the 1790s, these English novels are being reprinted, and almost immediately after their English publication in the United States. One final thing, I always have to share this because it's just a great example of the distinction between being a reader and being a collector. So I had to have a copy of Cecilia in my collection because of the text, technically, because we have this mention of Pride and Prejudice. There's this kind of climax in this work, Cecilia, so Burney's second novel. Austen loves this book. She cites it as one of the best novels. Pride and Prejudice is mentioned at the climax twice in this sort of big rhetorical flourish. So people often cite it as perhaps that's where she got that phrase. So I thought, okay, if I'm building this bookshelf, I have to have a copy of Cecilia. The reader, I want that text to read, and I did read it. Fine. But the collector in me asks not just which book do I want, but which copy of this book do I want and why? I waited for the right copy. And the right copy for me was this incredibly beat up copy. I don't know if you can really see it on the screen here, but I include that volume at the back because it's got this pinkish stain on the back, like across the speckled calf boards there. It's a little blush of pink. And normally, condition is pretty important in the book collecting world. It affects the price on the marketplace. So why would I want one that is clearly flawed when there are other choices? Well, the reason is because of the note here that the early owner has made. The early owner was this woman named Bettina. We know that because she put her name in it as well as her date of acquisition, which is 1782, which is the year of publication. And then she explains, this is her writing right there, by accident, a strawberry fell into the book, which has stained the leaves. And by the way, this is volumes 4 and 5. So she's at the very end of this incredibly long novel, and she is, so enraptured with it that she's not stopping to eat. She is eating while she is reading. And so what you get with book collecting is the reader is interested in the story in the book, and a collector is interested in the story of the book and of the lives that it has lived since. All right, let's move on to Anne Radcliffe. I love Anne Radcliffe so much. So Mysteries of Udolpho is the book that you hear a lot about associated with Austen's book Northanger Abbey, because, as I said, Northanger Abbey is often seen as a satire of Gothic novels. Catherine Morland reads the Mysteries of Udolpho, and one of the plot points is that she starts putting Gothic tropes onto the world around her. She thinks that the things that she's reading in the books could actually be happening in real life, and she mistakes novel plots, Gothic novel plots, for whatever's going on, in fact, at the titular Northanger Abbey. So it tends to be glossed very quickly. It's clearly just satirizing Radcliffe. But if you read the book with a slightly different eye, which I was inclined to after I read Udolpho myself, it reads incredibly differently, which is to say, The Mysteries of Udolpho was an incredible hit at the time. It was the book everyone was talking about. So people were reporting staying up all night reading it. Newspapers were printing odes in response to it. There was one anonymous reviewer who called it the most interesting novel in the English language. That reviewer was anonymous, but a number of scholars today believe that was Samuel Taylor Coleridge. People described Radcliffe in her time as an enchantress, a genius, unrivaled. Byron plagiarized her in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Critics associated her with Virgil and with Milton and with Shakespeare. She was called the Shakespeare of romance writers. So she was a huge deal. And when Udolpho specifically came out, there was a rumor going around about how much she had gotten paid for it. She was paid £500 for it, which was more than double the previous record paid to an English woman for a book. The person who held that before her was Frances Burney, by the way. And one publisher, Cadell, heard that amount, the £500, and he was so sure it was an exaggeration that he wagered £10 that it wasn't true. So not only did he lose that bet, then he went on to pay more for her next novel himself. He published her next book. So she was a huge literary sensation at the time, and everyone loved The Mysteries of Udolpho. And that's actually an assumption built into the book that we lose today, because the way that Austen writes Northanger Abbey in the sort of plot points that she's picking up from Udolpho, she assumes that her audience has read Udolpho and is familiar with it. She can make a reference and knows that her reader, her contemporary reader, is going to pick that up because, of course, everyone has read and loves Udolpho. They're all going to love Catherine Morland because she is just swooning with how much she loves this book, because we all felt that way, right? That's the assumption built into Northanger Abbey that we lose today because we no longer read Udolpho. And you see this actually quite explicitly in the book. So Catherine Morland says, "While I have Udolpho to read, nothing can make me miserable." And Henry Telney, talking about this specific book, says, "When I had once begun it, I could not lay it down again. I remember finishing it in 2 days, my hair standing on end the whole time." And I, too, had a very physical, visceral response to this book. I loved it. It was one of my favorites of all the reads that I did for this. I talk about it in the book. There was this one moment where I was so engrossed, just like that Bettina with her strawberry. I was so engrossed in reading my copy that while I was making coffee, I didn't notice that I was pouring the water into the wrong compartment, and it just went all over the counter, and I did not notice. I was so just taken into it. And I felt like if you actually go back and read these texts and allow yourself to respond to them, rather than sort of taking this hand-me-down knowledge of, oh, Northanger Abbey is satiring these melodramatic Gothic novels that were popular then, that there's a reason they're not popular anymore. Actually, if you like horror, if you like Gothic novels, if you like genre fiction, you should really give Radcliffe a try. But then part of what you see, if you go a little bit broader and you start thinking about imprints over the long term, is, if that's the case, if Radcliffe was so important, then why don't we read it again? These days, if people had that type of response to her, what happened? And there are a few things that happened. This is one of my object lesson examples of what happened. So Jane Austen, during her lifetime, was not nearly as successful as any of the women that are in the book that I talk about. Of the 8 women I talk about in the book, all of them far, far outsold Austen in her lifetime, were better known, were better reviewed. and had multiple editions, and all of them, in fact, had American editions as well. Austen had one American edition in her lifetime. Emma came over. But things like Mansfield Park from Pride and Prejudice, those all didn't come to the United States until the 1830s, until far after Austen's death. Austen continued to be read pretty regularly, but she was never a celebrity, never a superstar. And there's a moment where she has a real turning point, and that's this moment in 1870. Her nephew, James Edward Austen Leigh, publishes a memoir, and he gives us a lot of nuggets about her behind the scenes, and it hits at exactly the perfect time for what critical taste was shaping up to be, both in the United States and in England, which is to say there was a rising taste for the type of ordinary realism that Austen is so great at. One of the things that is so appealing about Austen is that she makes the lives of ordinary women feel extraordinary. And in her lifetime, that was actually seen as a drawback. People felt that high art had to be more dramatic situations. You think about like Macbeth and tragedies, you think about Milton's Paradise Lost. It's extreme, it's life and death. And that is how you do high art, is with, big, grand, epic scale type of plots. And so Austen, with her everyday, this sort of, the quiet confidence that you see in someone like Anne Elliot, all of that takes time to really be appreciated in critical taste. As critical tastes change in the 19th century, this book comes out at just the time when people are saying, oh, that's the type of realism we want. So William Dean Howells, for example, in the United States, was a huge advocate of Jane Austen. So this occasions a new critical reappraisal at exactly the right time in new waves of popular fandom for Jane Austen. This is what sets the stage for her becoming the icon that we know her as today, beginning in the 20th century and then ongoing with all of these endless and very good, I will say for the record, adaptations of her work and television movies, which then bring new generations back to the book once again, and it becomes this cycle, and she's an icon. And I use this as a comparison because at almost exactly the same time, the poet Christina Rossetti was a Radcliffe superfan. And she said, I want to do a biography of Anne Radcliffe, and I want to bring her work to a new generation. Anne Radcliffe was an incredibly private, retiring person. She actually, in fact, stopped writing pretty early in her career because she just wanted to be left alone. People did not understand that. And she was just not a social person, and she kept most of the private details truly private. So when Christina Rossetti started on this journey, she's looking in the British Library, she's trying to track down relatives. Anne Radcliffe didn't have any children, so it's by other branches. And she literally puts out calls in newspapers if anyone has any primary source material that's related to Anne Radcliffe, and she can't find anything. She can't get enough material to write that biography. And so she tells her publisher, quote, I despair and withdraw. This memoir was the thing that gave Austen a reassessment at exactly the right time. And Radcliffe didn't get that. Let's move on to someone who's very appropriate for the John Carter Brown, which is Charlotte Lennox. So this is the female Quixote. Before I want to talk about the female Quixote, it's her most famous book, but before I do, a little bit of context about Charlotte Lennox and her relationship to the early Americas, because Lennox, in fact, grew up partially in New York when it was a colony. Her father was in the military, and she had this really terrible experience where she was living and growing up in the colonies, but her family had a really hard time supporting her and her siblings. And so when she was a teenager, they shipped her back to the UK to be taken into the care of a wealthy aunt who then dies. And she's essentially orphaned in London as a teenager. But her early years growing up in the New York colony were incredibly formative for Charlotte Lennox, and her first book and her penultimate novel are both partially based. The first one's partially based in the colonies, and Euphemia, which is on display over there, is almost exclusively based in the American colonies and specifically New York. And when it comes to novels that are American novels and American writers, The first book that I'm speaking of is Harriet Stewart, and Harriet Stewart is very autobiographical. The heroine similarly starts in New York and then ends up coming back to the UK, and then the person who's supposed to take care of her dies and she's left alone. It's very autobiographical. But Harriet Stewart was published in 1751. There's really only one book that kind of qualifies as the first American novel before that, if you define first American novel as someone who is writing on American subjects, having it take place in there, who has also actually lived there and is writing it, as related to their own personal experiences there. A man named Edward Kimber wrote a novel in 1750 called The Life and Adventures of Mr. Anderson. And then there's Charlotte Lennox in 1751 with The Life of Harriet Stewart. So she is, in terms of American novels, a very strong contender when you think about who are our earliest American novelists. The Female Quixote is the main book, though, for the Jane Austen bookshelf because of its connection to Jane Austen. So the Female Quixote's plot is, perhaps unsurprisingly to hear, very much based on Don Quixote. The idea is that you have a main character, a heroine in this case, who has read a lot of those early modern romances and medieval romances, and that's her experience of society. So when she goes out into society, she expects it to be like the romances that she's been reading. And that is also, if you recall, just how I described Northanger Abbey, except with Gothic novels, because that's what Austen did. All she did was update the basic premise of the Female Quixote for her generation. It was the Gothic novels that were big in Austen's time. And we know this pretty explicitly, not only because the structure is very mirrored, but also because Austen talks about not only reading the Female Quixote, but rereading it and loving it in her letters. And this, I'll just mention very quickly, you might have a sense that that is not a 1752 binding. This book I acquired completely, the binding was disintegrated, and the text blocks, which is to say sort of the printed pages that had been sewn together before they get bound, those were barely holding together, and I needed to put some new binding on them in order to arrest the further deterioration, in order to make sure that they didn't get worse. So it needed a rebind of some type. And I thought, well, if it needs a rebind, well, why don't I work with one of my favorite contemporary working today bookbinders? So I contacted Sol Robora, who's a bookbinder based in Argentina, whose work I love. And I said, will you do something with this? And this is what she did. And I wish you could see it, but it is incredibly tactile. She creates these sort of impressions with different types of cloth and building up underneath. And so you just want to have it in your hands. So that's something to keep in mind if you ever have a book that you need to be rebound, or you're just interested in modern book arts. The art of bookbinding is not dead. It is not lost. There are a number of bookbinders working in that tradition today who are incredible. Let me move to my quick anecdote here as a little bit of a myth-busting moment when it comes to book collecting. So this is another copy of The Female Quixote. This copy is from Oxford University Press in 1970. This is a $25 book on the used book marketplace today, maybe $50 if you're shipping from the UK. And this was one of my most satisfying acquisitions because The Female Quixote, it was a huge hit when it came out, and it was commonly printed for about 100 years after its publication. So pretty good, pretty, in terms of what we're calling canonical, that was a classic for 100 years. But then once we get into the 20th century, it has fallen out of fashion. And the first edition that is published in the 20th century is this one in 1970, which meant that if you were a reader of Jane Austen in 1945, and you're reading her letters, and you see her talking lavishly about how good The Female Quixote is, you don't get to do what I did, right? Where you say, oh, well, I can go and look for a secondhand copy online from lots of different secondhand bookshops, or I can pull up a digitized copy, or there are lots of different ways that I can access that text. In 1945, it's not going to be in your local new bookshop. It would be very unlikely for it to be in a local used bookshop because, again, you're talking about the last edition before this was 1840. And then you can't, in 1945, generally go into a special collections and say, can I read your first edition of Female Quixote because Jane Austen loved it, right? A lot of special collections are much better today about bigger access, more broader terms for access for their materials. But still, in 1945, that was not going to happen, which meant that if you had had that moment where you wanted to take the rabbit hole that I took that led to this entire book, you couldn't have. And this is the moment when you could. From this moment on, Female Quixote is back in print, and it gets regularly printed, particularly in these sort of like world classics paperback editions that a lot of you see students have through the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And she has stayed sort of in currency since then. So for me, this $25 book, it's about the story of the book. This is an incredibly important story for Charlotte Lennox and very meaningful to me. So even though it was one of the least expensive books that I acquired, it's one of the most important as far as I'm concerned. I'm going to talk about two more and then we'll move on to questions. Charlotte Smith, I like to talk about mostly because she's kind of a dark horse candidate for influence on Austen, and also because her life story tends to infuriate people. So Charlotte Smith started publishing under duress. A lot of the women that are in my book, they were in similar positions of Austen, which is to say they didn't need to make money from the publication of their books. Charlotte Smith, in fact, did, because she was, at age 15, married to a man, and they were both from very wealthy families. So it was a typical kind of genteel arrangement of two families coming together in an economic agreement that was their marriage. And Charlotte Smith later referred to that as being sold like a Southdown sheep. So her husband, Benjamin, they did not get along. They didn't have a great temperament, and that's fine. That's not necessarily, uncommon in such an arrangement. But in fact, he immediately starts cheating on her. He is physically abusive, and he, in fact, goes through both of their wealth so thoroughly, at least their accessible wealth, that by the time she has had 11 children, he gets imprisoned for debt. Because yes, in the 18th century, you could be imprisoned for debt. And so she's kind of in a bad situation here. And while he's in prison for debt, she's visiting him and staying with him, and she gets pregnant with their 12th child. So while she's pregnant, she is working to try to get him out of prison somehow. But she was raised as this upper class woman. She has an incredible education, and she was not trained to any type of trade. The idea of making money is foreign to her. So she says, "Oh, well, I do have these poems that I just composed for my own enjoyment that maybe I can turn into a book and sell the book." This was sonnets in particular. And she goes to a publisher, and the publisher says, "No one wants sonnets anymore. Those are not in. This is not going to sell." And she gets a couple people on her behalf to advocate for it. It does get published, and it ends up being one of the most important books in the history of English poetry, because Charlotte Smith was the poet who revived the English sonnet. And this was said at the time. Her contemporaries laid that at her feet. In the 17th century, you have Milton doing sonnets. In the early 18th century, it goes out of fashion, just like that publisher said. So Alexander Pope and the Augustan poets, they're not writing sonnets. And it's Charlotte Smith's publication of elegiac sonnets that brings them back into vogue and becomes a major influence on the Romantic poets. So both Coleridge and Wordsworth are very explicit, not only about their personal debt to her, but about poetry, English poetry's debt to her. Wordsworth has this line, something like, English poetry owes more to Charlotte Smith than it will ever know or can concede. So this edition actually is a subscription edition that I have here, which I mentioned before is how she makes more money. The reason I wanted that was because her success with the sonnets is what gives her the courage to leave her husband. All of her children go with her, and her husband provides no financial support. And in fact, because of the legal complications there, he actually still can take her money anytime he wants. So she writes in order to get money to take care of herself and her children. She writes herself free. Okay, so that's why it's meaningful to me for something like this subscription edition, but it also plays out in the novels that are her connection to Jane Austen's bookshelf. So Austen read Charlotte Smith as a teenager and loved Smith's novels as a teenager. And we know this because Austen was already writing her own works as a teenager, and she talks about Charlotte Smith in them. So in Catherine of the Bower, which Austen was composing around 1792, she has two of the characters just gushing about Mrs. Smith's novels, and one of them specifically says that she prefers this one, Emmeline, over all of the others. And modern scholarship has shown, there are a number of ways that you see Charlotte Smith influencing not only her juvenile work, Austen's juvenile work, but also her fully fledged novels. And particularly, one of the themes that comes out that's made it into there from the biographical side is Charlotte Smith was very popular and prolific as a novelist of courtship novels, what we today call romance novels. And so when critics are looking back at this time period and they see her popularity and they understand a sort of quick summary, a quick gloss that she wrote courtship novels, they think, oh, that's just popular trash. And they completely miss how subversive Charlotte Smith is being in these novels. Because one of the themes that comes out over and over again in Charlotte Smith's novels is don't get married young. She'd been there. And a marriage of mutual affection is far safer than a marriage of economic stability. And you see this in Austen's novels. When you think about those themes, you can see Austen in conversation with Charlotte Smith. One of the great examples of this, actually, as you see it in Sense and Sensibility in particular, but also in Persuasion. So in Persuasion, Anne Elliot is in love with Captain Wentworth. And I'm going to spoil, can I spoil Austen? Is that allowed? It's a happy ending, okay? So Anne Elliot is in love with Captain Wentworth, but he's not captain when they first meet. He doesn't have any prospects. He doesn't have any good family. There's no clear way that he's going to be able to provide for her. And so she decides on the advice of her friends and family that she probably shouldn't marry him. And then fast forward a number of years later, then he comes back having essentially ascended the ranks during the Napoleonic Wars, becomes Captain Wentworth, and now actually has quite a bit of money and is a great marriage candidate. And Anne Elliot says, well, I really missed the boat on that one. And so that's what a Persuasion essentially is about. So in the end, they do come back together. And one of the things in it that I find is straight from Charlotte Smith is that something that gets effaced when we talk about it today, because we look at it and we say, oh, she shouldn't have listened. She should have followed her heart. Right? That's a lot of the common interpretation of Persuasion in Anne Elliot. But Anne Elliot says very clearly at the end, she says, I was right to turn him down the first time. We were totally unsettled, both in who we were as people and in our circumstances in the world, and we needed more time to kind of get grounded. So how this worked out is how it should have worked out. And that is a Charlotte Smith theme. All right, to end before we get to our questions, I have to talk about Maria Edgeworth. So Maria Edgeworth is, I already mentioned that the women in this book far outsold Austen in their lifetimes and were far better known. Edgeworth was, during the time that Austen was attempting to truly get published, which is to say about 1800 until she gets published in 1811, Maria Edgeworth is the most critically acclaimed, respected novelist working in the form that Austen wants to work in. She was so famous, in fact, that she was called by Marilyn Butler, quote, easily the most celebrated and successful practicing of English novelists from this period. But Austen would always joke, she would joke about Edgeworth always being her exception. So she had a niece who was interested in novel writing. And so she's encouraging her niece in her novel writing. And she says, I've made up my mind to like no novels really except Miss Edgeworth's, yours and mine. Always Miss Edgeworth, she's the exception. But moreover, Maria Edgeworth, she was someone who actually was sort of a watershed in the history of the novel, the type of social reform, politically engaged novels that we see Dickens doing. Edgeworth is the precursor for that. And she's also the precursor for the person who really takes the crown as the next big celebrity novelist. It's not Austen, it's Walter Scott. In 1814, Ivanhoe comes out. Not Ivanhoe, Waverley. Waverley comes out, and it's initially published anonymously, as was typical, but at the end, he has this whole section where he says, I was inspired to do this because of Mariah Edgeworth and what she did for Irish history. I would like to do the same for Scottish history. She is my model. I don't think I can get anywhere near her. He gives this homage to her in his ending. And later, Edgeworth and Scott become friends because they are essentially the two most celebrated novelists. So when Edgeworth is 55, she visits Scott in Edinburgh. And I'm telling this story because we have a quote about Edgeworth from this visit that is so good that I share it every chance that I get. So Scott's son-in-law was a big recorder. He wrote a famous Life of Walter Scott and was constantly just sort of paying attention and writing things down. And this is how he describes Mariah Edgeworth at 55. Quote, a little, dark, bearded, sharp, withered, active, laughing, talking, impudent, fearless, outspoken, honest, Whiggish, unchristian, good-tempered, kindly ultra-Irish body. I like her one day and damn her to perdition the next. How can you not love her? So Walter Scott remained just totally in awe of her when she was visiting. He called her the Lioness of Edinburgh. And she remained a hugely popular author all through the 19th century. So I mentioned that Austen, it took a while for her to kind of catch on. She was still popularly reprinted and commonly read, but next to her works and in much more numbers, like just numerically in terms of the number of publications that you as a collector can collect, Edgeworth is there entirely. And these are just a couple of pictures that I throw out to show. We associate the peacock, Pride and Prejudice. That's, if you may have seen that, it's a really famous design with, again, sort of a dark green background, and it has this big peacock on the front, and that's Pride and Prejudice that you see in all those tote bags. And there's also another really famous Austen edition from this era by A.A. Turbane that's on a red cloth with this elaborate type of gilt thing. These were also designed by A.A. Turbane. So in this time period, as we saw our first book, the book that started it all, our Evelina from the Cranford series, in that elaborate gilt emerald cloth binding. And then Edgeworth, we get the same thing. And Edgeworth, too, just like Burney, her books in the United States were coming out almost immediately after, or even the same year as they were coming out in the UK in American editions, and often in multiple editions in the same year. So there are a couple that are like in Georgetown, kind of in my backyard. I'm in DC, as well as up in Boston and Worcester. Isaiah Thomas, for example, her novels were immediately reprinted in the United States, essentially as they were coming out. And so she is, again, a sort of transatlantic author when it comes to fiction. And that is maintained all through the 19th century, and that only changes through into the end of the 19th century. So to end, I hope what I have shown here is that we have this kind of cultural admiration for the lone genius, but no writer works in a vacuum. Austen, in a really famous biography from the 1980s, was called the first great woman writer in English. But Austen never viewed herself as that, and she wasn't. Thank you.
So thanks so much. That was terrific. So we think of the novel today as sort of like the absolute art form in a way that we don't really with movies or even plays anymore. But in the 18th century and the 19th century, it wasn't really viewed that way. And one of the things at the Athenaeum when I first got there was I would read the minutes from like 1838 and 1839, and the curators and the proprietors were bemoaning the rapacious appetite for the novels while Sallust sits solemnly on the shelf. So how did the novel become the novel?
Oh, that's a big question. How long we got? Well, let's talk about the 18th century and Austen's context in particular. So as you mentioned, in the 18th century, the novel was this newish form for the English language, and it rapidly attracted not only gendered connotations, which is to say it's written by women and it's consumed a lot by women, which already created problems for a lot of critics. But moreover, it was seen as just not serious in the way that history was, right? It was reading for entertainment, and reading for entertainment was inherently bad, according to some people. And by the way, I am barely summarizing that. I have actual quotes in the book from Hannah More, one of the women who says that. She says very clearly that women who are reading these books because we condemn novels because they encourage, like a ease of mind, a spirit of relaxation. That's the phrase. Novels encourage a spirit of relaxation, and that's a problem, right? Because reading was associated with essentially education and education only. And so the idea that you would read Anne Radcliffe so that you would have these cliffhangers and like chills down the spine was kind of anathema to a lot of people who saw reading as categorically something else. The gendered connotation did not help, especially because women did not have the same infrastructure for education. And a lot of young women, the expectation was, since they weren't being sent to Eton, the expectation is that they would get most of their education through a self-study or a tutor-directed study of reading. And so they didn't want them reading novels. And Frances Burney works very hard not to become a novelist. And when Evelina comes out, she doesn't want to admit that she's the one that she's read it because she's afraid her father will be ashamed of her and be ashamed that he has a novelist for a daughter. So that is the context for what I'm talking about in the Northanger Abbey passage when Austen says, why are we doing this? Can we stop, please? But again, she's doing that. Northanger Abbey is published posthumously in 1817. Burney's book, Evelina, that's 1772, I think is when it comes out. So we're talking decades. And so you do have quite a bit of movement. Austen can say those things in the Regency period, that in the 1770s, 1780s, it's still very much a shady thing. And over time, it gets legitimized, I'm sorry to say in part, because men become very famous for doing it. So you have Walter Scott, and you have Dickens, and you have Thackeray, and as that moves and the novel becomes more masculinized, that's part of what leads to it being, oh, we can call this high art now. And again, I am paraphrasing a number of academic studies. If someone like please cite your source, I'll pull out the book and we will look together and I will point out the specific texts. But it is very interesting how we so typically will put our own understanding of what a novel is today and assume that that's how a novel was perceived in the 18th century. But all of these things are shifting. Tastes change, opinions change, what we think is stylistically appropriate, what we think is appropriate for a reader, all of that changes.
That's fascinating. Of all these authors, obviously all of them had some kind of influence on Austen, maybe a profound influence on her. Is there one that you feel was particularly resonant in her work, someone that she echoed quite a bit?
I think Frances Burney is probably the first and foremost one. I like to give the example of, in fact, Evelina, where when Austen is the first time that she attempts to sell a novel, she tries to sell an early version of what would become Pride and Prejudice. It's called First Impressions of the Time, and this is in the late 1790s, and it's right after the publication of Frances Burney's novel, Camilla. And her father sends the novel to Burney's publisher and pitches it as a novel in 3 volumes like Evelina. He explicitly compares it to Evelina. It doesn't get published. But the comparison goes even further because Austen doesn't sell it then she keeps revising it. It turns into what we now know as Pride and Prejudice. There is a famous scene at the beginning of Pride and Prejudice. So even if you've seen, one of the movies instead of the books, or read the book, in the ball, right at the beginning, where Elizabeth Bennet overhears Mr. Darcy say something incredibly rude about her, like he's judging her, and she hears that, and that sets the tone for their relationship and kind of creates a barrier between them that takes them longer to reconcile. It's part of that delicious tension that we really respond to in courtship novels and romance novels. And if you describe that scene of the heroine being at a ball, and then, that overhearing of the hero saying something judgmental about the heroine, in Austen's time, they would have said, oh, you mean like that scene in Evelina? Because there's a scene in Evelina that is just that, and it was the famous scene. So you actually see Burney's novels weaving in and out of Austen. And I think that we often want to give Austen credit for originality like, oh, well, she really pioneered free and direct discourse and things like that. That's not true. She doesn't need to be original to be great. She's in dialogue with these writers whom she loved. She's saying, oh, I see your ball scene. I'm going to do my own version of that ball scene. So in reading these novelists, what I learned was not only did I find a lot of great books, but I read Austen differently, and reading her novels became an even richer experience. Like, she is not, denigrated because they are also great.
Right. And many of these authors were successful in their own time, very wildly successful in some cases. What did success look like at that time, and how is it different than how we think of a best-selling author today?
Well, we are talking about a very small ecosystem compared to what we're used to today. So Evelina was a huge bestseller. It went through something like 15 editions in the 18th century, plus it went through, I think, 3 different editions in the United States, plus it went to a German translation, a French translation, also a Russian translation, as I recall. And so in terms of that day, that period, that was a wild success. But books in that era were incredibly expensive, and most people were not buying books outright, and the people who could afford them were a tiny percentage of the public, not to mention, education, literacy rates, et cetera. So oftentimes when we're talking about this type of literary and cultural arts production, we're talking about the top 10% or the top 1% in the sort of economic realm. Austen herself owned very few books because she couldn't afford them. She often relied on books that her father owned or that her brothers owned, and she also had a subscription to a circulating library, which is kind of like Netflix, right? You pay a monthly fee and then you can check out as many volumes as you want. And that was how she got them, because she couldn't literally afford the books. So yes, the idea of a bestseller is a really slippery term compared to what we have today. But you can still trace it by its ripple effects. The fact that Camilla gets 3 different American editions within about 6 months of it coming out is huge for how infant the fiction marketplace in the United States was in the 1790s. So slightly different standards, and you have to take that into account.
Right. And Austen is, clearly inspired by these authors, but you write at one point that you had a sense always that Austen knew who she was as a writer, that she was very confident and assured. How did she break from these authors? Did she innovate? How was she different?
How was Austen different? I think each of these authors is different in their own way. They're each bringing their own voice and their own concerns, their own priorities to their work. The thing that I respond to in Austen is that combination of confidence and discipline of style, where what she does is she has such confidence in her own voice that she keeps it to a very high level of refinement. I often talk about Pride and Prejudice. I think is essentially a perfect book. There are too many Bennett sisters. But other than that, it's a perfect book. And I think that if you look at these different authors, you find different values. You find things in them that might speak to you more. So, for example, as I said, I loved reading Udolpho, and leaving aside Pride and Prejudice is this perfect book. My reading experience of Udolpho was so vivid. It was a much stronger reading experience than any of my Austen reads. I also happen to really love genre fiction. I love Gothic novels. I love horror, right? So that makes sense that I might have that response. And similarly, when people ask me and they say, okay, well, where should I start with these authors? I say, well, what do you like? Do you want more that's like Austen? Maybe Frances Burney Murray Edgeworth. Do you like genre fiction? Do you like comedy? What do you like? And then I will tell you where to go from there, because each one of them has their own strengths. And in the case of Austen, I think that her confidence and how she uses her confidence to be incredibly disciplined as an artist is the truly defining thing that I respond to.
I have to ask you about one particular person in this book. I was very fascinated by this person. Can you talk about Lady Isabella Finch and a little bit about literary patronage in the 18th century?
Sure. Okay, so Lady Isabella Finch I mentioned with Charlotte Lennox that she was essentially orphaned in London as a teenager. And she finds her feet because of Lady Isabella Finch. On the ship to London, she gets a reputation, Lennox gets a reputation for being incredibly precocious because she's able to compose poetry at incredibly high quality for a teenager, and everyone's very impressed by her. And so when this terrible kind of orphaning happens to Lennox, and she is young and she's lost, she has no resources, no family to take care of her, Lady Isabella Finch steps in. She's this aristocratic woman who is famous for being the only woman at court who had her own library. And she steps in as Charlotte Lennox's patron, essentially, and gives her a home and a place until Charlotte Lennox can stand on her own 2 feet as an adult. And Charlotte Lennox's first book, which is a book of poetry, she dedicates to Lady Isabella Finch. And Charlotte Lennox works in this very interesting moment with 18th century patronage. I'm talking about how small the print culture was in the 18th century and how it's growing, and technology and changes in education lead to a complete transformation in the 19th century. But in the 18th century, when it's that small, you just have this transition period between the old school patronage system, thinking of people like Edmund Spenser, into this more modern, oh no, I am a author. This is a business proposition. I am selling my work to publishers and making a living that way. Charlotte Lennox, working pretty much right in the middle of the 18th century, 1752 is when Female Quixote comes out. She does both. So she'll dedicate something to an aristocratic patron, and they will provide some support. And she's also getting paid for the right to copy, essentially the early version of copyright from the publishers. And you see this repeatedly with her. There was another work of hers that she dedicated to, I'm trying to remember who it was. I think it was a duke. And he offered to get her a royal pension as thanks, which would have set her for life. But instead she said, could you get my husband a job? So she got that instead. He got a government job thanks to the Duke. And so the patronage system still existed. And the other big comparison with that is Samuel Johnson. He also made his living through a scrappy sort of writing for pay and patronage. He himself was offered a royal pension for the same essentially reason that Charlotte Lennox was about 7 years later. So it is a transition period. And Lennox, I think, is a really good case study for that.
Much of the book wrestles with sort of the canon and its usefulness and how the canon developed. The notion that when we include people in the canon, we naturally exclude others. It's just sort of the nature of the beast. But first, I wonder if you could tell us, what is the canon? And what does the canon sort of mean in the 21st century?
So I pose the canon as a series of logical propositions. Essentially, the idea of the canon is, here's a list of books that are considered good enough that they still have something to say to readers far beyond their initial publication. That it's not just the novel of the moment, it is something that 20 years down the line, 50 years down the line, 100 years down the line is still worth reading and will still feel fresh to readers. And there are too many books. We cannot read all of the books. So how do we know which is which? And the idea of the canon is you have a bunch of authorities, critics, tradition, new people working on it, and they're all saying, I have read all of these books, and I am telling you that these 3 are the best, right? So we're saying, okay, well, let's listen to authorities because we can't read them all, but these are people, this is their job, so we can trust their authorities, right? And so that's how the kind of canon gets formed, is it is a consensus broadly defined of books that are considered still relevant and still worth reading far beyond their initial publication. And I will be very clear that I've read a lot of books, or I've pulled a lot of books off the shelf and started reading them pretty much just from that idea of, oh, this is a classic, right? This is a work that's in our canon. So Moby Dick, for example. I love Moby Dick. Like, the canon has very rarely led me astray. Like, they are great books. And being great is only the beginning of the qualifications for becoming a canonical author. There are a lot of reasons why great books don't then become the ones that get reprinted or get put on syllabuses that don't get taught in high school. I don't know if you've seen any of the articles that have been coming out for the anniversary of The Great Gatsby, and there's a big discussion about how at Fitzgerald's death, The Great Gatsby was kind of a critical failure. It only sold, I think, 2 copies in the year that he died, and the second edition couldn't even sell out, and he considered it a failure. And then the Armed Services edition came out, and all these soldiers were reading it. And then a student edition came out in the 50s, and once it was in schools, it was a perfect novel to teach with. Then it becomes a classic. It was not a classic in 1925. It was very popular, but it did not seem to have the legs upon Fitzgerald's death that we now think is inevitable, and Austen was the same. So canon formation is incredibly subjective, and it's based on a lot of the right place, the right time, the right person pushing the right button. I call these turning points in the books. And that's why I find that so interesting for this exploration, is because, again, these books are good. That's not why they are not canonical. It's for other reasons. And so I'm exploring what those other reasons are. And what it also led me to say is the canon is super useful. It exists for a reason, but it should not be a brick wall. It should be a springboard. Just like, again, if you like Austen, I was doing this thing where I was like, oh, Austen died so young. She only completed 6 novels in her lifetime, and I'm just going to be stuck reading and rereading them for the rest of my life because there are only 6 of them. So I just keep going back to them. And I was ignoring the fact that she was writing in this entire tradition of courtship novels with writers who she loved and who she thought were great and who she was modeling herself after. And once you say, oh, yes, I can read Austen and Burney and Maria Edgeworth, just that slight switch to use the canon as a starting point rather than the end point was what was so transformative for this reading experience for me.
Oh, that's great. I'm also interested, you discussed the Burkean idea of the sublime, which was a big Edmund Burke idea, this tension between what's popular and what actually endures over time. And there's many hugely popular writers in our own time. I think of Stephen King, actually, where if you were actually doing a survey of this period of literature, you would have to sort of pay attention to Stephen King, but you can already feel him sort of slipping into the mist. So is it possible that there's some quality to some works that just makes them internal in a way, or not really?
This is going to get me in trouble. I think that traditionally, and this is less and less the case, but traditionally, scholarship and criticism has prioritized, again, works that they see as high art rather than popular, and that popular often is mutually exclusive with quality. I think actually Stephen King is an incredible writer of American realism, period. And I think that he is worth studying and worth reading in 100 years. And you can see why I like Anne Radcliffe. I like genre fiction. I like science fiction and fantasy and horror. But the academic study and the critical appreciation of these genres has been very slow to develop over hundreds of years. So the type of side-eye that novels got as a genre in the 18th century, you still kind of get that with modern works of fantasy today. And there are far fewer scholars who are working with, say, popular fiction or the pulp paperbacks or even, Astounding Stories, science fiction pulp magazines. That is a slow development that we've seen through the 20th century. It's a great development, but it has taken time. And I think that what you see is these types of biases replicating themselves. What we're trying to do a lot now, a lot of modern scholarship, is correcting that. And my hope is that if we keep going down that line of correcting it, instead of saying only realism is great, but horror is not great, right, and therefore not worth studying, I want to get rid of that dichotomy. A lot of modern scholarship goes down that line. Then I don't think that we're going to have that same question the way that we have traditionally.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm a huge genre fiction fan, by the way. Especially, Lovecraft is from this area. And what you said about the canon was so interesting to me because Stephen King led me to Lovecraft. I'd never heard of him. And then I read Lovecraft and I was like, oh, this is different.
Yeah, indeed.
I can't let you go without asking about your career in rare books, because can you tell us a story about something that came across your desk or that you found somewhere that you least expected it, some crazy rare book story that...
I mean, boy, It does happen. Oh, I got a good one. I've got a good one. I was going to say the Evelina story is kind of that, where I bought a book not even caring what it was, and then it turned into my own book. But I have a story that kind of connects with a lot of what we've been talking about. So it was similarly, I bought a book. I didn't buy a book exactly for its cover. The cover was a bonus. So I bought an 18th century work that was sort of a critical work about some classical authors, but it was a 18th century aesthetics argument on, classical authors. And so that was interesting to me for a couple different reasons. And I have a couple institutions that are interested in that type of thing. So I bought it thinking this is something I want to explore more. This is one of the privileges of being a rare book dealer, is that you can see something and say, oh, I would like to learn more about that. I want to research that. And you kind of use buying it as your excuse. And so that's what happened with this book. And it was bound in just these recycled wrappers. And they were recycled, I know, because they had printing on them. So it was something that had been printed. It was an advertisement. And, once that ephemeral advertisement was no longer needed, they had all of this extra paper around. So they used it to create these quick, ad hoc bindings to bind up these types of works. And as my quick due diligence, while I'm cataloging this, I start just Googling phrases from the advertisement. And it turns out that advertisement was the incredibly rare notice for a medical dictionary that Samuel Johnson wrote the preface and the notice for, that was so rare that not even the Houghton Library, which is famous for its Mary Heideckel's collection of Samuel Johnson, did not have. And so my selling point for that book went from, this obscure 18th century text about classical authors, into, here's a Samuel Johnson thing you have never seen. And, it's like a great moment for a book dealer. You can just add a zero because you were smart enough to just Google the phrase on the thing. So the beauties of the internet, I think a lot of the times we get very, you're a book person, you must not like ebooks or digital age or all of that. No, this is a great time to be doing research. You have so many resources at your fingertips. When I was working on Jane Austen's bookshelf, I would read about an author, and then I would immediately be able to pull up a digitized copy, either on Gutenberg.org or HathiTrust, that are working with libraries like the John Carter Brown for digitized copies. Like, these things are incredibly more accessible than ever today. That female Quixote story that I told about the 1970 copy, that's not even an issue anymore. Any of the authors that you've seen today, if you're curious, you can go home and immediately start reading one of their books on your phone. That's incredible.
That is incredible. I think we have time for one more question before we turn it over to the book sale. I want to make sure everybody buys a book. It's the best way to thank an author. The question we always ask is, what are you reading?
So I'm reading a couple things at the moment. I mentioned, or I think you mentioned, and I kind of referenced, I do a lot with the romance novel. I study the romance novel's development in the English language, and I sell and collect the history of the romance novel. So I'm often reading vintage or much older romance novels. So I'm currently reading a vintage romance novel by a woman named Rachel Gibbon, a contemporary romance kind of comedic author in the style. Think of like Nora Ephron, but book. Jennifer Cruzy, if you like that. So that is the one I was reading on the plane. And the other book that I left home is almost like a modernist romance novel. It's by Clarice Lispector. So Clarice Lispector was a modernist writer working in Brazil in the 20th century, and she's had this amazing phoenixed reputation in English thanks to this new slew of translations from new directions. And she is a profound writer. And people often compare her to James Joyce, for example, or Virginia Woolf. In her homeland of Brazil, she was a Ukrainian born, but she moved as a refugee to Brazil very young. She is so famous that you could just say Clarice and everyone knows who you're talking about. But her reputation in the English language has only begun to start to grow because of this new group of translations. And I think that also is actually a perfect example of the type of things we're talking about. Being good is only the first quality, but then you need advocates, you need turning points. Benjamin Moser, who oversaw a lot of these translations, the project and the biography in English, it's thanks to him that I am reading Lispector and am blown away by her.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks everybody for joining us. Have a great weekend, everybody.